I get straight and meditate like a Buddhist. I'm dropping flavor, my behavior is hereditary, but my technique is very necessary. Blame it on Ice Cube.
Good afternoon, my name is Lewis Williams, and Jake came to me. He said, I need a motivational speaker. I need an expert in his field. I need an all-round great guy. I said, Jake, I'm your man. And that's why we are here to listen to me talk to you today about zombies, the cultural phenomenon. So how did we get to this talk being about zombies? Well, I sent out a document asking people what they wanted to listen to me talk about. And I gave them 4 options: Princess Gaga, Disney, the greatest director ever born, Tim Burton, and zombies. And zombies came back as the number 1 choice. And I'm very glad, because although these 4 are recognizable cultural icons, in my opinion, zombies have easily become the most ubiquitous of the 4. They're all around us. They're even on laptop lids. Film and TV is the obvious place to find the zombie, and it has been since the 1930s, but just look at those figures. Look at how popular the zombie has become in film and television. The Walking Dead, 22.37 million viewers weekly. It's won 6 Emmy Awards. It's in the mainstream now. World War Z grossed over $200 million, major studio backing, and I put that it was nominated for a Teen Choice Award. You know, this isn't an Emmy or an Oscar or a Golden Globe, but it shows that zombies are now popular with all age ranges. But we move on. It's no longer just film and television. Music, and particularly the rock genre, now uses the iconography of the zombie, starting with Michael Jackson, with Thriller, but now Avenged Sevenfold, The Gorillaz, Rob Zombie, New Year's Day. Children's entertainment, children's toys, the idea that this undead beast, this undead monster, can be applicable to youngsters. Dolls, Scooby-Doo, children's films, children's games. Adult games, but not just male games. Games like The Sims that attract potentially a more female audience. As well as games not necessarily about the zombie, but use that iconography to gain a cross-demographic appeal. Call of Duty Black Ops being my example. Zombie experience days. It seems perverse that we would want to experience an apocalypse. But this has become more and more popular with team building events and zombie runs, especially around the Halloween time of year. Advertising. This is an advert for the Mini Cooper, which claimed that its car was a zombie outbreak response vehicle, that it was zombie-proof. The idea that the undead, decaying corpses, can be used to make products appealing to audiences. And finally, even pin-up girls have been zombified. The idea that undead, rotting corpses can be somehow sexually attractive to people. Gross. So I had to come up with a focus for this talk, and I kind of danced around with a few different ideas, flirted with the idea of the history of the zombie, and decided that we'd be here till Christmas. So I decided to define the term zombie, because as I was talking to some of the students, it became aware that some people actually didn't really know what a zombie was or what constituted a zombie. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, yeah, the word zombie has become quite muddied, certainly recently, certainly post kind of 2001, actually what constitutes a zombie. So we'll be looking at 3 different focuses: the historical definition, going back to voodoo mythology; the cultural definition, brought in with George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead in 1968, and the philosophical definition, the idea that do we have to have died to be classed as undead? So first, the historical definition of the zombie. The zombie as a term came into the English language in 1819 due to slavery practices from Haiti, but it's been around since the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was steeped in voodoo mythology. The idea being that you would die and then a voodoo witch doctor would bring you back from the dead. Now, at this point, the fear didn't surround the idea of being eaten by a zombie, because zombies didn't eat people in voodoo mythology. The idea and the fear was that you would become a zombie through being resurrected by a voodoo witch doctor and put to work in cane plantations. So you would die, you'd be brought back from the dead, and then you would be enslaved for the rest of eternity on these plantations. And there's textual evidence to suggest that these zombies did exist. So this is from a journal from a traveller in the 19th century, where he was told by someone who lived in Haiti to come with him on his travels. He said, "Superstition, but I assure you this of which you now speak is not a matter of superstition. If you will ride with me tomorrow, I will show you dead men working in the cane fields." Now, it's believed that these dead men actually did exist, but rather than being dead and resurrected, they were heavily drugged. So these voodoo witch doctors would drug people to the point where they appeared dead, and then bring them back to life, keep them in a state of drug-fueled sleep almost, and put them in the fields to work. So that's an example of what these drugged-up zombies might have looked like. Not literally dead, but rather mentally dead. And we can see these links in modern media today. The idea that somebody who is drug-fueled could be a zombie. And I think we often say things like when we're feeling particularly tired or particularly hungover, we say, I feel like a bit of a zombie today. Well, this idea, I think, draws back to those roots of the voodoo zombie, the idea that somebody is heavily drugged and sedated, so feels zombified. And it's this voodoo zombie that entered cinemas in 1932 with Victor Hugo Halperin's White Zombie. The film did very, very well, cost $50,000 to make and took over $8 million. It seemed to producers at the time like they'd found their new antagonist to sit alongside the more gothic antagonists like Dracula and Frankenstein. However, they were wrong. The problem being that the zombie film developed into much more of a B movie than they would have liked it to. So we got films like The Walking Dead, not the popular TV series, but a very low budget film. The Mad Ghoul, Bela Lugosi and Voodoo Man, and The Devil's Daughter. And the problem was that these were all very low budget. They all treaded the same ground, and essentially the zombie wasn't a very scary antagonist because it looked like that. Okay, the zombie tended to be just an oversized man sticking his arms out, no rotting flesh, no blood, no teeth. And they were usually controlled by an over-mustachioed, bushy-eyebrowed puppet master. Not very frightening at all. It also lacked focus. It seemed that the zombie hadn't quite found its iconography. It hadn't quite found its generic traits, its narrative traits. So films like Del Tenney's I Eat Your Skin gave us perhaps more akin to what we're familiar with today, the kind of rotting flesh, the skulls, the decay, while films like Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers gave us the zombie as this kind of alien that would consume you, perhaps metaphorically rather than literally. While Zombies of Moratau by Edward L. Kahn took it right the way back to the voodoo stuff, the Haitian voodoo mythology. So you kind of had lots of different iconography trying to exist alongside each other and trying to wrestle with one another. And that kind of continued until the 1960s. When George A. Romero brought out Night of the Living Dead. Romero revolutionized the genre. He invented the rules that have remained true since 1968. And that's how we move on to the cultural definition. First thing that Romero did was he attributed the zombie to society. He made the zombie scary, so we no longer had the idea that it was just one person being ruled by a puppet master sticking their arms out. It now reflected societal concerns of the time. So these hordes of zombies were used as a cultural metaphor for things like protests about the Vietnam War, for things like the civil rights movement and those uprisings, and for things like nuclear protests after the late 1940s and 1950s and fears surrounding nuclear war. So the zombie now reflected things that were happening in people's lives, rather than this disparate antagonist like Dracula and Frankenstein had become, hence why they died out. And George A. Romero continued this idea of reflecting societal concerns in the rest of his trilogy. So Dawn of the Dead, 1978, reflected growing consumer culture and fears around globalization, before Day of the Dead reflected kind of post-Cold War sensibilities and the idea that America was perhaps a bit of a warmonger. He established aesthetic traits as well. So we had the narrative traits established by George A. Romero, but also the aesthetic traits. Things like, to kill a zombie, you have to destroy the brain, something picked up on in Shaun of the Dead with the cricket bat. The idea that zombies gather in hordes and they are unstoppable, used to great effect in World War Z in 2013. The idea that a zombie is a slow, lumbering, shambling creature, as our half-bodied friend from Walking Dead shows. The idea that surviving the apocalypse isn't glamorous, isn't glorious. There is no glory in sitting through the apocalypse. And that essentially we all die an anonymous death eventually and end up on the fiery pits of hell with all of the antagonists that we were trying to outlive. The idea that the zombie is unexplainable. So, pre-Romero, we could explain zombies away as being brought back to life by voodoo witchcraft. Well, now there's no explanation. We can debate, and we can suggest, and we can try and attribute religious undertones to this, but there's no hard and fast reasoning behind these creatures. The idea that anybody can become a zombie, and anybody can be feared, and anybody should be feared, and anybody will eat your face, established by Mr. Romero in 1968. And these were the traits that were that have continued on since this landmark event, and were further popularized by Michael Jackson in his Thriller music video in the 1980s. However, this definition has become slightly less popular in recent years, kind of post-millennial, kind of post-2000, 2001, and I put that down to two things. The idea surrounding terrorism and the fear of terrorism following 2001, 9/11, and continued media coverage of pandemics and global viruses, such as the Ebola virus that we're in the middle of at the moment. Suddenly, Romero's zombies no longer scare us enough. You know, these idea that these slow, shambling creatures are coming towards us, they're not quick enough. Pandemics are fast, they strike fast, they kill you quickly. Terrorism can happen completely out of the blue, without warning. So we get films like the Resident Evil franchise, where zombies are able to run, jump, transform. And Quarantine, the remake of REC, where zombies are these rabid, enraged creatures. This brings us on to the philosophical idea of the zombie, and the question around whether to be a zombie, we have to have once been dead. So Romero tells us, and the traits that Romero established, that in order to be a zombie, we have to have risen from the grave. However, this builds on the assumption that in order to be a zombie, the body must be dead, but some part of the brain must live on. Well, why can't the opposite of that be true? Why can't it be that the brain is the thing that has shut down and the body has managed to live on? If not, become stronger? Are we not then still undead? And that's the philosophical debate surrounding zombies, that as long as one of those two has died, we are both dead and alive simultaneously. And it doesn't matter which way around that is. And that makes the current rule breaking that we've seen post-millennial okay. That means that we can still call zombies, like in World War Z, zombies. That's quite all right. So we get told that zombies don't run. We get told that zombies don't climb, that zombies don't reason, and that zombies don't communicate. However, in a remake of one of Romero's own films, they do all of these things, as well as climbing on the ceiling. So that's a zombie kind of climbing along the ceiling like some kind of zombie Spider-Man, which is why I've put a picture of zombie Spider-Man. Whenever we kind of get these viral infections, we get it pulled to the idea that these victims could be zombies. So as soon as the Ebola crisis happened, we got mock news reports that got into the mass media before they got shut down of an Ebola victim coming back to life. We have the Florida cannibal who chewed off a homeless man's face, who was called a zombie. Now, he wasn't dead. He hadn't risen from the dead, but he'd been taking a drug called bath salts, and that had degraded his brain. According to the mass media, he's a zombie. This is supported by the iconography of zombie films being used in the mass media, perhaps to create panic. So the image on the right is from Rec, but the image on the left is from an Ebola story in the news. Very similar iconography, the idea of hazmat suits and that kind of stuff. To conclude, my opinion, I feel like we've come full circle. So we've gone back to the idea of the zombie being more of a mental state than a physical state. So from the voodoo idea of a drug-fueled corpse, background to the idea of rage and infection, that the body can still be alive. However, I'm not very happy about this. And I'm glad to see that The Walking Dead is pulling us back to the traditional Romero-style zombie, that shambling nature, that rotting flesh, that moving corpse, the muddied and dirtied clothing, and a slow and painful death. I think films like 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, World War Z are much more akin to pandemic thrillers like Carriers and Contagion rather than true and core zombie films. So they carry much more of the iconography of these films where the landscape is ravaged by a virus rather than ravaged by a zombie. And very finally, I'd like to invite any questions that you may have picked up. Oh, Emily?
Hi.
Hello.
Is this working? Yeah.
What's your name?
My name's Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi. Nice to meet you, Lewis. Just a quick question. Do you think that the idea of a zombie can be taken seriously within, the horror genre? Or do they just not belong in the sort of B-movie world where it's not taken as seriously?
That's a good question. Thank you very much. And I'll answer that one. And I'll answer the question that I thought you were going to ask as well, because I'm that good. Okay. Yes. I think that they can be taken much more seriously than antagonists such as Dracula, Frankenstein, the werewolf, the mummy.
Are they not traits of like a B-movie sort of,
I think horror as a genre has traditionally been a B-movie genre. It grew out of Poverty Row Studios. However, I think if you look at the kind of budgets that are being thrown at the horror genre as a whole, but certainly at zombie films as well, with films like World War Z, I think it's time we admitted that the zombie has become a mainstay of Hollywood genre filmmaking. Now, the other question I thought you were going to ask is, can zombies actually exist in the real world? And my answer to that question would be, it depends which definition you run off. Okay, now I am not saying that people can come back from the dead. However, I do believe that there one day could be some kind of rage infection and some kind of pandemic that will make us all a little bit crazy. And in that way, we will have some kind of 28 Days Later style zombie apocalypse. That's certainly what I'm preparing for anyway. And I would certainly encourage all of you to go out and buy your water purification tablets and tents. Well, thank you very much. You're an excellent audience. Who thought you could fit 3,000 people in this theatre, eh?
I'm expressing with my full capabilities, and now I'm living in correctional facilities. Cause some don't agree with how I do this. I get straight and meditate like a Buddhist. I'm dropping flavor, my behavior is hereditary, but my technique is very necessary. Blame it on Ice Cube.